Welcome to Essentials for Adoption Attuned Parenting, a podcast exploring how parents can best relate and connect to their adopted child. If you have adopted, or even if you are thinking about adopting, this is the show for you. Discover tips and tools for adoption attuned parenting. This is the podcast for building a strong foundation for your adoptive family. And now, from growing intentional families together, here are your hosts, coaches, and adoptive parents, Susan David and Gayle Swift.
Hi, this is Susan from San Diego. Welcome to the Essentials for Adoption Attuned Parenting. I'm so glad you could join us. As always, I'm here with my co-hosts, adoption coach, author, adoptee activist, and my colleague at Growing Intentional Families Together, Gayle Swift. Good morning, Gayle.
Hi, Susan. Today is a special day. Imagine 50 episodes. We've covered a lot of topics on those 50 episodes, and they've all had an emphasis on the adoption attunement principle, which is a kind of our guiding philosophy at Growing Intentional Families.
And you know, Gayle, you have been the mastermind and have spent a lot of time developing the adoption attunement approach. And I consider you the resident expert at Growing Intentional Families Together. So would you remind our listeners what it means to practice adoption attuned parenting?
Boy, I'll tell you, in raising our own kids, Susan, there were some things we wish we had done differently. When Casey and I were writing our book, that's my daughter, Casey, as you know, but our listeners might not. We came up with the idea of the first ingredients of adoption attunement. At Growing Intentional Families, we've continued to refine those ideas. So adoption attunement is based on two foundational truths. First, it recognizes that while love is essential in parenting an adoptive child, it's only a starting point. It's not enough on its own. And second, adoption attunement acknowledges that adopted children have additional needs that arise from their being adopted. And adoption attunement as a philosophy distills this recognition into a now 17-step approach. Imagine 17 steps.
Actually, when you do practice it, it becomes natural.
Oh, I would agree. Yeah, it becomes intuitive too. Once you understand that our kids have unique needs, the adoption attunement principles are easy ways of kind of cutting out, what is in the best interest of my child in this given moment for me to interact with them as a parent. You know, it makes it easy. It's like a cookbook to some extent. Once you know the ingredients, you can recognize, well, for this type of cooking, I want to add a little bit of coriander, but for this, I want oregano. A complete idea of all the spices on your shelf.
That's a great analogy. Years ago, I did think that love would be enough. You want to be a parent, you want to be a good parent, and you know that the first ingredient would be love. I'm so thankful that you and I in our coaching from Growing Intentional Families Together is part of a new way of thinking about adoption, really acknowledging that while love is necessary, it's certainly not sufficient when raising our adopted children. So a core idea throughout our podcast, right, as we celebrate 50 episodes is, you guessed it, you are going to have to do more as an adoptive parent. That's not a bad thing. It's just the way it is.
Well, yeah, it's like if you happen to have a child that has diabetes, or a child that has celiac disease, or a child that has allergies, you have to have an increased level of awareness so you can meet your child's needs and keep them healthy. And it's the same thing with adoption. They have some additional needs, and we are intentional about how we meet those needs.
So let's just jump right in and highlight some of our previously published topics. What do you think about that?
I think that's great.
You know, our first episode focused on what is coaching, since guess what? Not only are we adoptive parents, but we're also adoption coaches. What do you think the benefits are to the coaching approach?
You know, I think, Susan, one of the biggest differences in the coaching approach is that coaching focuses on solutions, on what's working versus what isn't working, instead of focusing on right, wrong. We're not therapists, so we're not digging into what the issue is. We're looking in, how do we cope in the moment? And our coping approaches will vary with each of our kids and in any given moment. That's why you need a big toolbox.
I love that you pointed out the three things: is we don't blame, we're not fixing, we're not focusing on right or wrong, but also solutions. What can I do this moment to solve this issue? And hey, does it work or does it not work? And then we move from there. So speaking of coaching, one of our podcasts featured intentionality. And of course, intentional is in our company name, so we must think it's important. So coaching really places a great deal on taking an intentional approach. And adoption coaching is not really different from that. One of our podcasts featured intentionality and how it can be used to build connection with our children. You mentioned that before in the adoption attunement principles. What we do is about connection with our kids.
Oh boy, that's really the bottom line, isn't it? We want to build a deep and abiding connection, a lifelong connection. And that will take intentionality because they have different needs. So I think you were referring to episode 17, Susan. And, parenting, especially adoptive parenting, is not a seat of the pants time. You need to have a clear approach, intentional approach. Intentional parenting recognizes we must be educated and prepared regarding our choices in the way that we interact and respond to our kids. For example, intentionally opting for time in instead of time out. And the reason behind that is because we often, as possible, avoid re-triggering our children's fear of separation, rejection, and abandonment, because we know that underneath a lot of their behaviors.
I'm reminded when you talk about the time in, time out, when we mark a birthday, right? And you have a big party and a big celebration. And for your child who happened to be adopted, that might not be the approach that we would take. So we kind of step back as adoptive parents and think, hey, how does this work for my child who happens to be adopted?
Oh boy. And understanding that birthday celebrations might be tricky is a huge piece of awareness, because instead of getting annoyed with our kids when they break down on this big event that we spent a lot of time and effort and maybe money on orchestrating, we understand this might not be what our kid needs. It might be what we would like to do, but if it doesn't serve our kids, it's not in the best interest of the family. And that comes from adoption attunement awareness.
So we were just speaking about connecting, and that reminds me, I want to give a shout out to my first co-host, Joanna Stefano. She was my original co-host. And early on, she wanted our listeners to understand not only the gains that we associate with adopting. An obvious one would be having a family, right? That's a total gain.
For sure.
But she also wanted listeners to really get the losses associated with adopting and how they can show up throughout a lifetime, so that we can, the coaching approach, right, move forward. And what do we do with that information? So we spent 4 episodes on this topic of the gains and losses, and it ended with a great spot with our colleague Sally Ankerfeld using a storytelling exercise as a way to process one's loss.
That's excellent. And Susan, I think you mentioned in an earlier conversation, that's episodes 2 through 6. So that's a good reference point for our listeners. I think we talk about metaphors. Here's another metaphor. If you're in a car accident and your leg is totally damaged and they have to amputate it, and then you get this fabulous new state-of-the-art prosthetic, it allows you to interchange the feet on it. You can run, you can walk, and you can do all sorts of things, maybe even be stronger than you were originally. It doesn't mean you become unaware of the fact that you missed your original leg, And so too with our kids. They might be really happy and content and happy in our families. And at the same time, they might think about, wonder about, and miss their birth families. Those two experiences can coexist. And that's a big piece of adoption attunement, is we recognize as adoptive parents, we can't be everything to our kids. We can be loving, connected, supportive parents, but we can't in totality replace their families of origin.
I hear you say family of origin, and this reminds me about the languaging. This is an adoption attunement principle also. Watch your languaging. So rather than talking about the triad, when you think about the triad, that was a common term. Now we're thinking about constellation, right? The three adoptee, adoptive parent, and the expectant mother, or later on the first family.
Right. And also the extended family of both the birth family and the adoptive family. They're all part of the picture, all affected by the reality of being an adoptive family. And Susan, language is so important and it's incredibly powerful. It can heal or it can hurt. It can inspire or discourage, respect or coerce. Appropriate languaging is so important. And discipline and awareness when it comes to language can make a huge impact on the connection we build, the rapport we share, the empathy we experience, and the respect that we offer. So for instance, when we're talking, if we're a prospective adoptive family and we're talking about a woman who is currently pregnant, oftentimes people will refer to her as the birth mother. Well, that's not exactly true. She's still pregnant, so she hasn't given birth. She's an expectant mother. Mm-hmm. And if we refer to her as a birth mother, there's a subtle piece of coercion there that says you only matter in terms of being a birth mother. Yeah. And she might feel obligated to place with you if you continually refer to her as our birth mother. She's not your birth mother. When she gives birth, she's the birth mother to that child. She's never the adoptive parent's birth mother.
Mm. That's true. And that reminds me of one of the things we do in our podcast is to challenge persistent cultural myths about adoption that are untrue or unhealthy, or like this languaging thing of birth mother. So,
and oftentimes these lack of awareness around language is not intended to be mean or disrespectful, but if we can wake people up to the realities of sensitive language, respectful language, it really serves everybody. We all benefit in that case.
That's one of my favorite episodes, the challenging cultural myths, right? Mm-hmm. That's episode 37. Do you want to check that one out?
One of the big myths that still persists is that adoption is a transaction. It occurs on a given day. The baby is placed or the child is placed with you, and the birth mother walks with relieved of her burdens, and the adoptive family, yay, we become parents, and the child is now totally incorporated into the adoptive family, and nobody looks back. Well, as people who have kids in their 20s and 30s, we well know through personal experience as well as through professional education, that is so far from the truth. Everybody looks back. It constantly spirals throughout everybody's entire lifetime. So that's why it's important to look at pre-existing beliefs and cultural myths, because some of them not only are inaccurate, they actually do a disservice to the entire adoption triad and adoption constellation, and it perpetuates unhealthy behaviors.
Now, you just sparked something. We talk about the essentials for adoption attuned parenting, but our podcast is also good for people that are thinking about adoption. These are all issues that you'd be well served to think about before you engage in the process. Speaking about myths, Gayle, makes me think that all of our 49 episodes were grounded in some type of authoritative source. So we're not making this up on the fly.
Boy, Susan, that is such an important point. We're not just making stuff up,
Yeah.
We've worked hard to become educated and prepared. We've engaged in research ourselves. We've been parents or we've been an adoptee. But most of what the average person knows or understands about adoption doesn't come as a result of research and professional education. Much of it comes from kind of the beliefs that are kind of floating out in the ether of culture. And much of that knowledge it's outdated, it's inaccurate, and some of it is downright wrong. So our work is grounded in the latest research, continued education and understanding, as well as really deeply listening to adult adoptees share their insights of their lived experience when they tell us and tell other professionals what did and didn't work as they were being raised in an adoptive family. And then we blend all this information in with our own personal experiences. So, for example, we talk about the 7 core issues of adoption. When we were adopting our kids 30, almost 40 years ago, nobody mentioned the 7 core issues of adoption. It was just take your baby home and everybody will be great. Start the fairy tale. But we don't believe in fairy tales. We believe in education and awareness. Because as we know, adoption is not totally benign. So instead of advocating for more adoption, I don't think we know that we would prefer to see more resources to keep families together. However, when adoption is the answer, it also takes a thorough look at how we can do it better.
Right.
So if we do adoption, it needs to be adoption attuned. It needs to be in the best interest of the child, et cetera, et cetera. You know, Susan, in addition to Sally, we've also hosted other special guests on our podcast.
Always learn so much from our guests, and it's a bright spot in doing our podcast.
Well, Lori Holden, who's the author of The Open-Hearted Way to Open Adoption, a real star in the adoption world. She was on our podcast, really interesting episode. We also had, now Lori is an adoptive mom. Our next guest that I want to mention was Lynn Grubb. She's the adoption genealogist. She's been the editor of, I think, 5 books on adoption. She's an adoptee. And we talked about how to reconnect or what to think about before connecting in reunion. She's done a lot about, we had her on more than once. Remember another time she talked about DNA and whether or not we want to encourage our kids to test before they're 18 or after they're 18. That was a really interesting episode.
Another thing that we do on our podcast, since we do have people in our family that are people of color, and we try to be sensitive, that's another adoption attunement approach, right? Be sensitive and understand that your child of a different race or culture. We've had someone join us from Partnerships for Permanence. That's a nonprofit in Minneapolis. And what they do is they help young adults who happen to go through the foster care system get jobs. What do you do for a resume? Move in the world that they may not have been familiar with previously. So her name is Lola Adabera, and she joined us discussing racial justice and furthering young adults who've grown out of the foster care system. And we actually had a really lively discussion with a few of the young leaders in that nonprofit. It really fit under the category of what we adoptive parents and prospective adoptive parents need to hear. So sometimes it could be a little tricky to hear what they have to say, but I think it made us better parents when we left that broadcast.
Yeah, you know, sometimes there are uncomfortable truths. We have to deal with them, kind of take the ostrich approach, bury our heads in the sand. It doesn't benefit anybody.
You know, another person that we had on, an adoptee, a man, we usually do not have men on the podcast for whatever reason. Maybe we should change that, right? Yeah. But Simon Ben, and he talked about the diamond within us all. And as an adoptee like Lynn Grubb, hearing their stories, I've said, makes us even more sensitive to what we can do better. So his work with children focused on showing parents how to help their children be happy, build their child's self-confidence and their strength, their resilience. We learned his story as an adoptee that led to his work empowering adoptees and overcoming adoption trauma.
But, you know, I think even though it's sadness and loss in adoption, that's a fundamental truth. Our kids' lives do not have to be only about sadness. So this is just one piece of the pie. We can have lots of space for joy as well. We also had Abby Jacobson, Susan. She was an adoptee and a therapist that practiced for many, many years, and she is now operating as an adoption consultant. She came from 4 generations of adoption, which is a lot of generational trauma. So her interview was extremely interesting. It had a lot of values. I recommend people listen to that. And finally, one of the last ones I think we should mention in particular is we opted to interview Sharon Butler Obazi. She is an adoption coach, and we researched her work and interacting with her so much on the podcast that eventually we invited her to become our colleague. So we feel really blessed to have her on board with us. You can check out Sharon's story as an adoptee and a Black woman in episode 37 in July of 2021. And she can be found at Coaching to Impact or on our own website, growing intentional families together. GiftFamilyServices.com.
We also talked about current events that was interlaced throughout our 49 episodes. And so one of the things that we all experienced was the COVID-19 and the isolation. We got really good at using Zoom.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah. For our adopted children, there's that extra layer. And we had some podcasts that had some ideas for how to deal with that.
Yes, we did. And I think they were helpful.
Another thing that happened to us while we were doing the podcast, we had the terrible, terrible murder of George Floyd. And that brought up for us this idea of racial justice and how are we a part of that as adoption coaches, and what can we do differently? We had a 4-part series that discussed what we might be doing, how to look at the events and as adoptive parents.
I hope we helped parents understand color blindness doesn't work in transracially adopted families. I think that was one of the topics in that particular episode is, just as that we acknowledge our kids' gender, their health, you can't pretend they don't have a race or color. Even if parents wanted to pretend race doesn't matter, that we love our kids, are blind to their race, the world doesn't treat them that way. And if we parent them that way, we're not preparing for the reality of walking through the world. The world notices their color. The world notices some of our families don't, quote, match. And if we don't include that in part of the recipe with which we engage and interact with our children, we won't prepare them. So for instance, people of color tragically have to have the conversation with the kids about driving while Black, for instance. If we think of parenting in a colorblind way, that's a conversation we probably won't have. And that means we leave our kids unprotected and unprepared for if they do get stopped, they don't know the precautionary things they should do to protect themselves. We can't deal in fairy tales and wishful thinking. We have to deal with the hard truth really goes out in the greater world. And even if people are nice to our children of color when they're with us in the store, for instance, or at a restaurant, when they get old enough to be out on their own, that umbrella of insulation from the outfall of prejudice and bias, that won't be there, And when they come back and say, when I was at a restaurant, they served everybody but us. We waited 20 minutes and nobody served us. If as a colorblind parent, we say, oh, I don't think that's true, they wouldn't do that, we're doing our kids a big disservice. Those kind of things do happen.
Truly, they do. I want to encourage our prospective adoptive parents to think deeply about this. It's a lifetime journey you're taking on. And you might have written about this. You have to think about how to integrate another culture. It has to be authentic.
And for sure, your child of color shouldn't be your first relationship with a person of color. True. And once they're in your family, they can't be your only relationship with a person of color. You become a transracial family. You have to walk through the world like that. Look to develop really valid relationships with other people of color. Look for mentors that can help your kids understand what it's like to be an Asian child, or an Asian person, or a Black person, or a Hispanic person. Because as a Caucasian person, you don't know.
Another topic that we had was the gun violence that we're experiencing. That's not new. We did talk about the need to keep our adopted kids feeling safe. All kids, but there's that extra level again. And as difficult as it might be, we owe it to them to have grounded, calm, and age-appropriate conversations about what's going on in the world. So that's what I love about your blog, Gayle, that you actually offer suggestions. Sometimes you offer questions to help us figure it all out. That's the coaching approach, right? Maybe that's why a lot of our podcasts were based on your blog posts, because, real world stuff. And my personal favorite of the blogs that you've written was handle your own stuff. Now, that was kind of tongue in cheek, right? The way that I say it. But it's so important for us to look at the emotional baggage that we might have come into parenting with and handle it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. As adopted kids get older and hit adolescence, it tends to be a little bit of choppy seas, almost always. It's easy for parents to see those are kid issues, but oftentimes there are parent issues there as well that also need to be addressed. So as your kids approach the age where, for instance, they might be fertile, it might subconsciously dredge up feelings of sadness about, I never could conceive a child. And that might affect the way you respond to your kid. It's not pretty, but it's human. We don't have a robotic response like if A, then B. So as human beings, we have complicated reactions. So we might be 10% envious and 90% ecstatic, but they coexist, you know? And so if you might even have the conversation with a child that is expecting and say, I'm so happy for you. I wish I could have grown you inside my body and sheltered you from the moment of conception, and bring them into your sadness so that they recognize it's not about them. And they can see, oh, I thought I saw this little expression cross mom's face. What's that about? Is she mad I'm pregnant? You know, so that they understand. Don't keep people guessing. Have open conversations about this messy stuff.
Even though that parents handle your own stuff blog and podcast was maybe more lighthearted. You have some serious, that got serious all of a sudden, didn't it?
Well, that's adoption.
Yeah.
Well, complicated. I also like the one I wrote about ethical considerations in adoption. That can be pretty intriguing because there's lots of gray areas there. And when you really have baby hunger or a real obsession almost to adopt, it's easy to be tempted with some of those gray areas. And we're here to tell you, you don't ever want to do that, because eventually that child that you might adopt through that gray or black market adoption is going to be an adult, and you're going to have to face them eye to eye, and they'll have questions about how they came to join your family, and they're going to want you to justify your choices, and you'd like to be able to do that with a clear conscience. So always choose the ethical approach.
Yeah.
You know, rejection casts a long shadow. So we also talk about that, and that's a serious subject as well. And then we mentioned that as being part of AQ, specifically the 7 core issues of adoption. Almost universally, all adoptees are sensitive to being rejected because, let's face it, for whatever reasons, their first family couldn't or wouldn't make space for them in their family. They may have had very justifiable reasons, or the state may have intervened because they couldn't get a handle on addiction issues and stuff like that. But anyway, rejection casts a long shadow. And even listen to interviews and read memoirs by adult adoptees in the 50s, 60s, 70s, they still feel that real raw spot that is connected to rejection. So we need to be aware of that as we parent.
And you mentioned AQ, that's shorthand for adoption attunement.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, you talk about adoption attunement. Your AQ is kind of akin to that emotional intelligence idea. So what's your adoption attunement intelligence?
Being a good adoptive parent, we need all our intellectual intelligence, IQ, lots of EQ, emotional intelligence, and we need to be steeped in AQ, our adoption attunement intelligence. We need it all.
So Gayle, one of the other things that we've featured on the podcast and the blog, Mother's Day or holidays. So one of them was Mother's Day, and we focused on nurturing the ties that bind and how we can nurture respectful, healthy relationships between ourselves as mothers. Birth mother, adoptee, and adoptive mother can wrestle with the fear of rejection. We talked about that just a moment ago, and of not being good enough. It could be easy to fall into seeing one another as competitors. I know that's hard to admit, isn't it? But how much better would it be if we can actually see ourselves as allies joined by a common mission to ensure the health and well-being of our children? So that's what all this is about anyways, right?
Yeah, that
Our
was one of my favorite blogs actually that I wrote.
And then we included one about fathers as well. So it was fatherhood blessings for adoptive dads and birth dad. And I mentioned we talked about holiday celebrations. Another favorite of mine is managing a sometimes too opinionated family member, also creating fun memories and setting ourselves up for success in the coming new year. Resolutions, everybody makes them. And we've talked about that for us as adoptive parents, how that would look. Guess what? We're celebrating once again 50 episodes of the Essentials for Adoption Attuned Parenting.
I think that's a big accomplishment. And I know our commitment has been to help families be more deeply connected. We've been committed to helping families develop relationships that endure time, that are deep, profound, and respectful. Remember, these are our observations as coaches, Susan, and as adoptees and adoptive parents. And we know that each person and every family are unique, and their experiences may be different from ours.
Yet our hope is that our listeners would consider adoption attunement practices as a guide for parenting their adoptive family.
So Susan and I invite our listeners to share your experiences with us. We'd love to hear about it. Go to the Growing Intentional Families Together Facebook page to leave your comments. We invite folks to visit our website and read our blogs. There's lots of them there. I think over 400 the last I checked. And you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter there as well.
Tell us what's going on in your family and let's talk about it. In fact, we are in the process right now of creating a special new webinar series for those individuals who are just beginning to think of adoption as a way to create or expand their family. It answers the what you need to know, who can assist you, things you need to know but didn't even know to ask about, and finally, a highlight, I think, what you need to know about adoption from an adult adoptee and professional adoption coach who just happens to be mine and Gail's colleague. We mentioned her previously, Sharon Butler Obaze.
Yes, so contact us at www.giftfamilyservices.com to explore this possibility.
That brings us to a close for today. I'm Susan from beautiful and always sunny San Diego.
And I'm Gail from equally sunny, roastingly hot sunny Florida, the Sunshine State. And remember, adoption matters. Talk about it, read about it, learn about it. Till next time, so long.
Thank you for listening to Essentials for Adoption Attuned Parenting. If you liked the program, please leave a rating and review on iTunes to help us spread the message about building strong and connected adoptive families. If you'd like more information about growing intentional families together and their adoption coaches, as well as to sign up for your free coaching consultation, visit giftfamilyservices.com. We have enjoyed being with you and invite you to join us again next time for another Essentials for Adoption Attuned Parenting.